It was one of those evenings where everything looked carefully arranged, as if every detail had been planned just to impress the guests. The hall was large, softly lit, and decorated with a quiet elegance that made people lower their voices without even realizing it. Small groups of guests stood around talking politely, holding drinks, exchanging smiles that were more formal than warm. Nothing about the evening suggested anything unusual was about to happen. Among the guests was a woman who did not stand out in any obvious way. She wore simple clothing, neat but not flashy, the kind that blends into a crowd rather than draws attention. She moved slowly through the hall, observing more than speaking. She was not someone who tried to be noticed, and in a place like this that made her almost invisible to most people. Still, there was a quiet calm about her, like someone who carried thoughts much deeper than what appeared on the surface. She had not originally planned to attend anything like this. Life had brought her here through a series of small, ordinary decisions that did not seem important at the time. A polite invitation, a suggestion from someone she could not easily refuse, and a simple agreement had placed her in this environment. She did not fully belong here, and she knew it. But she also did not feel the need to escape. The center of the hall was dominated by a grand piano. It was polished and elegant, placed in a way that made it both a decoration and a statement. Most people walked past it without giving it much thought, except to admire it briefly. To them, it was part of the luxury of the place, nothing more. The woman, however, noticed it differently. She had always been sensitive to sound, to rhythm, to silence. Even when she was young, she would listen closely to small details in music that others ignored. But she never spoke about it. In her world, talents like that were not something to show off. They were kept private, like personal thoughts. As the evening continued, a small change in atmosphere began to form. A few guests were invited to share light entertainment. Simple performances meant to keep the mood pleasant. Some laughed, some politely declined. It was all casual, nothing serious. Then, without much planning, someone mentioned the piano. The suggestion was made lightly, almost as a passing comment. It was not directed at anyone in particular at first. But then a few eyes slowly turned toward the woman. Someone remembered that she had once mentioned music in a conversation. It was vague, forgotten by most, but in that moment it became important enough to bring her into focus. First, she did not respond. She simply looked toward the piano, as if considering whether she had even heard the suggestion properly. There was a brief silence around her, the kind that forms when people wait for someone else to act first. The attention was not harsh, but it was present, and it carried a subtle pressure. Then the request became clearer. She was asked, politely but directly, if she would play something simple on the piano. The words were chosen carefully, almost as if to lower expectations. Something simple, something light, something that would not take much effort or skill. The way it was said suggested that no one expected anything impressive. She hesitated, not because she could not play, but because stepping forward meant becoming visible in a room where she had remained unnoticed until now. It meant shifting from observer to performer, from background to center. That kind of shift always carried weight. A few seconds passed. The room did not rush her, but the attention did not leave either. People waited with mild curiosity, some already losing interest, assuming she might refuse. But then she gave a small nod. It was quiet, almost uncertain, but it was acceptance. She walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because the distance was long, but because of what it represented. Conversations in the background softened slightly, as people slowly turned their focus toward her. Chairs were adjusted, glasses were lowered, and the gentle noise of the hall began to fade. When she reached the piano, she did not immediately sit down. She stood there for a moment, looking at it as if remembering something distant. The polished surface reflected faint light, and for a brief moment, she saw her own reflection. It was calm but thoughtful. Finally, she sat down. Her hands rested above the keys, still and careful. The silence around her grew thicker. It was not complete silence yet, but it was close. People were now paying attention, not because they expected greatness, but because something about her hesitation made them curious. She took a slow breath. And then, she placed her fingers on the piano keys. The first moment was delicate. She did not rush. The initial notes were soft, simple, exactly as requested. A basic melody filled the room, gentle and unassuming. It was the kind of tune that could easily be forgotten if one did not listen closely. Some people shifted slightly, their attention already beginning to drift. It was what they had expected, something harmless, pleasant, but not memorable. A few looked away, returning to their quiet conversations. But not everyone did. A small group remained focused on her. There was something in the way she played that did not match the simplicity of the tune. It was not loud or dramatic, but it carried a sense of control. Every note seemed placed with care, as if even the simplest sound had meaning. The woman's expression did not change. She kept her eyes on the keys, fully absorbed in what she was doing. It was as if the room around her no longer existed. The piano had become the only thing that mattered in that moment. As she continued, something subtle began to shift. The melody, still simple in structure, started to feel deeper. Not because it changed drastically, but because of how it was being played. There was emotion in it now, quiet but present, like a story being told without words. The room slowly began to notice again. Heads turned back. Conversations faded once more. The earlier distractions lost importance. People who had stopped listening now found themselves drawn back in without fully understanding why. The woman's hands moved with growing confidence. The hesitation from before was gone. Each note flowed into the next with a natural rhythm that felt almost effortless. Still, she remained composed, never showing off, never forcing anything. What had started as a simple request was beginning to feel like something more than anyone had expected. And yet, no one in the room fully realized it yet. Not until the next moments would everything begin to change in a way that no one there would forget. The room slowly settled into a strange kind of attention that was different from before. It was no longer casual conversation or polite interest. Something about the woman at the piano had shifted the mood, even though the music itself was still soft and simple. People who had not cared a few moments ago now found themselves watching more closely than they intended. She continued to play, keeping her eyes on the keys. Her posture remained steady, but there was a quiet change in her expression. It was subtle, almost invisible, like someone slowly remembering something they had once known very well. Her hands moved with more ease now, as if the piano was no longer unfamiliar to her. At first, the melody remained exactly what was asked of her. Stayed simple, light, and easy to follow. But something in the way she played it began to change the feeling of the room. The same notes now carried a deeper tone, as if they were no longer just sounds, but small pieces of emotion being placed carefully into the air. A few guests leaned forward slightly, not because they expected anything dramatic, but because they could sense a difference they could not explain. It was not loud or impressive in an obvious way. It was something quieter, something that made people pay attention without knowing why. The woman did not look at the audience. She seemed completely absorbed in her own world. The noise of the hall, the soft movement of people, even the distant sound of glass being placed on tables all seemed to fade away for her. Only the piano existed. There was a moment when someone in the back whispered something, but the sound quickly disappeared into the growing focus of the room. Even those who had earlier looked away were now turning back. The shift was gradual, but it was happening. The melody began to stretch slightly. Still simple, still recognizable, but now shaped with more feeling. A soft pause here, a gentle rise there. It was as if she was not just playing notes, but speaking through them without words. People exchanged brief glances, unsure of what they were experiencing. Some assumed it was just a pleasant performance, nothing more. Others felt a quiet curiosity growing inside them. They could not yet name what was changing, but they could feel it. The woman's fingers moved more confidently now. There was no hesitation left in her touch. Each note seemed to follow the next with natural flow, like water moving over smooth stone. Her breathing remained calm, steady, almost unnoticed. Then, something small happened. The melody paused for just a moment longer than expected. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was just a pause. But in that pause, something changed in the room. The silence felt heavier, more meaningful. It was not empty silence anymore. It was silence filled with expectation. When she resumed playing, the sound came back slightly different. The same tune was still there, but now it carried a deeper emotion. It felt more personal, as if the music was no longer just something learned, but something lived. A few people stopped shifting in their seats. Conversations that had almost restarted faded away again. Even those who had been uninterested before now seemed drawn in, unable to ignore what was happening. The woman's expression remained unchanged, but her focus deepened. It was as if she was now remembering something through the music, something that could not be spoken aloud. Her hands moved with quiet certainty, and the piano responded clearly to every touch. The simple tune that had been requested was still present, but it was no longer simple in feeling. It had grown layers without changing its structure. It was like looking at something familiar under different light and realizing it had always been more than it appeared. The room was now almost fully attentive. Even those standing at the edges of the hall had turned toward the piano. The soft noise of the gathering had nearly disappeared. There was stillness spreading through the space, not forced, but natural, like everyone had slowly agreed to listen without speaking about it. The woman did not rush. She never forced the pace. Each note came with care, each pause placed with intention. She seemed to understand something about timing that could not be taught easily. It was not about speed or complexity. It was about feeling. Some guests began to look at each other again, but this time without speaking. Their expressions showed confusion mixed with quiet admiration. They were not sure what they were witnessing, but they knew it was no longer ordinary. The melody rose slightly in emotion, still controlled, still gentle, but now carrying a deeper weight. It felt like a memory being unfolded slowly, one piece at a time. The piano no longer felt like an instrument being played, felt like a voice. The woman's shoulders remained relaxed, but her hands carried more expression now. The way she pressed the keys, the way she released them, even the smallest movement seemed to matter. There was no wasted motion. The audience was now fully silent, not because they were asked to be, but because they had chosen it without realizing. The sound of the piano had taken all attention, leaving no space for anything else. And yet, even in this growing silence, no one fully understood what was about to happen next. They only knew that the performance had changed into something deeper than expected, something that could not be easily described. The simple tune was no longer just a tune. It was becoming something far more powerful than anyone in the room had anticipated. The room had now fallen into a deeper kind of silence than before. It was no longer the polite quietness of people listening out of courtesy. It had become something heavier, something that held the attention of everyone without asking for permission. Even those who had originally shown no interest were now fully drawn into what was happening at the piano. The woman continued to play, still seated calmly, her eyes focused on the keys. Her expression had not changed much on the surface, but something inside her seemed to be unfolding. It was as if the music was slowly unlocking something that had been kept hidden for a long time. The melody, which had started as something simple and almost forgettable, was now carrying a stronger emotional weight. It was still based on the same structure, but the feeling had changed completely. Each note now seemed to carry intention, as if it was part of a story that could not be told in words. People in the room began to notice this shift more clearly. At first, it was just a feeling that something was different. Then it became impossible to ignore. The sound of the piano was no longer just background music. It had become the center of the entire space. A few guests who had been standing near the edges of the hall slowly moved closer without even realizing it. Their bodies reacted before their thoughts did. There was something about the music that pulled attention in a quiet but powerful way. The woman's hands moved with growing confidence. There was no sign of hesitation anymore. Every movement felt natural, almost like she was not thinking about the keys at all. It was as if her hands already knew where to go before her mind could decide. A soft change in rhythm appeared again. Not sudden, not dramatic, but noticeable enough for those who were really listening. The melody stretched slightly, allowing space between the notes. That space made the silence around it feel even more meaningful. In that silence, the audience felt something unusual. It was not excitement or surprise in the usual sense. It was something deeper, a quiet emotional pull that made them reflect without knowing why. Some looked down, some stared at the piano, and others simply froze in place. The woman did not look up even once. It was as if the world outside the piano no longer existed for her. She was completely inside the sound she was creating. The calmness in her face suggested focus, but there was also something else. A kind of emotional honesty that could not be hidden. The melody slowly began to rise again. It did not become louder, but it became fuller. The sound carried more depth, like layers being added one by one. It felt like the same simple tune was being told from a completely different place inside her. People who had earlier thought it was just a casual performance now found themselves completely silent. Even small movements like adjusting a glass or shifting in a seat had stopped. The room had unified in attention without anyone asking for it. There was a moment when the music softened again, almost to a whisper. That moment created a strange tension. It felt like something important was about to happen, even though nothing obvious had changed. The audience could sense it without being told. The woman's fingers slowed slightly, holding certain notes longer than before. Those held notes created a feeling of waiting. It was not uncomfortable, but it was deeply emotional. It made people stay completely still, as if moving would break something fragile. Then, without warning, the melody shifted again. Not into something different, but into something more intense. The same simple structure was still there, but now it carried a stronger emotional expression. It was as if a hidden layer had been revealed. A few people exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Words felt unnecessary in that moment. Everything was already being communicated through the music. The silence in the room was now complete, except for the piano. The woman's posture remained steady, but her playing became more expressive. There was a deeper connection between her emotions and the sound now. Each note seemed to reflect something personal, something that could not be separated from her experience. The audience could feel that the performance was no longer just about playing correctly. It was about expressing something real, something that could not be measured or judged, only felt. Slowly, the melody reached a point where it felt like it was building toward something. Not in a rushed way, but in a natural emotional rise. The sound carried more strength, and yet it remained controlled and graceful. Some people in the room felt a slight change in their emotions. Not dramatic, but enough to make them more aware of their own thoughts. The music seemed to reflect feelings they had not paid attention to before. The woman's hands moved with quiet precision. Even though the emotion in the music had increased, her control remained steady. There was no chaos in her performance. Everything was balanced, as if she had complete understanding of every note she played. The piano now felt like it was speaking a language everyone could understand without translation. It was not about technique anymore. It was about connection. Something silent but powerful was forming between the performer and the audience. The room remained completely still. No one interrupted. No one looked away for long. Every person was locked into the moment, waiting for something they could not define. And yet, even as the emotion grew stronger, there was still a sense that the most important moment had not arrived yet. The music was building toward something deeper, something that would change the way everyone in the room experienced that evening. The woman continued to play, unaware or unconcerned about the passage of time. For her, everything existed in the present sound. Each note was part of something larger, something unfolding slowly but with purpose. The simple tune was still there, but it was no longer simple in any way that mattered. It had transformed into something that carried emotion, memory, and meaning all at once. And as the final part of this phase of the performance approached, the room remained in complete silence, waiting for what would come next, without knowing that everything was about to change even more deeply. The silence in the room had become almost unreal. It was the kind of silence that people do not notice at first, because it grows slowly, quietly, until it becomes the only thing they can feel. No one was speaking now. No one was moving in any casual way. Even small distractions had disappeared, as if the entire space had agreed to focus on the same single moment. The woman continued to play the piano, still calm, still steady, but now something had clearly changed in the energy around her. The melody, which had once been simple and soft, was now carrying a depth that could not be ignored. It was no longer just a tune. It had become a feeling shared by everyone in the room. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence. There was no hesitation left in her touch. Each note came naturally, as if the piano itself was guiding her hands. She did not look around. She did not seek attention. Everything she needed seemed to exist only in the sound she was creating. The audience, however, was no longer passive. They were fully present now. People who had earlier stood with indifference were now completely still. Some had their hands resting without movement. Others stood without even realizing how long they had been in one place. The music had taken control of attention in a way that felt almost gentle, but completely powerful. The melody began to rise again, not in volume, but in emotion. It grew in depth, like water slowly filling a space that had been empty for too long. The notes were still simple in structure, but the way they were played gave them a meaning far beyond their form. A few people felt something unusual in their chest, a quiet emotional pressure that was hard to explain. It was not sadness or happiness alone. It was something in between, something that made them reflect without trying. The music seemed to touch places in them that had been ignored for a long time. The woman's expression remained composed, but there was a subtle change in her focus. It was as if she had entered a deeper level of connection with the piano. Her posture was steady, but her presence felt stronger, more grounded, as if she had fully accepted the moment she was in. The melody shifted slightly again. It was still familiar, still based on the same simple tune, but now it carried a sense of movement. It felt like a journey unfolding step by step, without rushing, without force, but with certainty. In the room, people began to notice each other's reactions. Not with words, but with glances. There was a shared understanding forming silently between them. Something unexpected was happening. Something that had gone far beyond what anyone had assumed at the beginning. The piano sound grew fuller, not louder, but richer. It filled the space in a way that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. It was as if the performance had created its own world inside the hall, one that everyone had been drawn into without resistance. The woman's hands continued to move with precision. Every press of a key seemed intentional, even when the movement looked effortless. There was a balance in her performance that suggested both control and surrender at the same time. Control over the instrument, but surrender to the emotion. The audience could now feel that the performance was building toward something important. There was a rising tension, not uncomfortable, but deeply engaging. It was the kind of feeling that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. The melody softened for a brief moment again. This pause felt different. It was not empty. It was filled with expectation. The silence between the notes seemed to carry as much meaning as the notes themselves. Then the music returned with a slightly stronger emotional force. It was still gentle, still controlled, but now it had a deeper intensity. It felt like a memory being told more clearly, as if something hidden was slowly being revealed through sound. A few guests lowered their gaze, as if the music had become too personal to watch directly. Others kept their eyes fixed on the pianist, unable to look away. There was no distraction left in the room now, only presence. The woman's breathing remained calm. Her body showed no signs of strain. Yet the emotion in the music suggested something powerful was happening within her. It was not visible, but it could be felt through every note. The melody rose again, and this time it carried a stronger emotional wave. It was not dramatic in a loud sense, but it was deeply expressive. The simple tune had now evolved into something layered, something that felt both personal and universal at the same time. The audience was completely absorbed. Even those who had originally underestimated the moment were now fully engaged. There was no judgment left, no doubt. Only attention and feeling. The piano seemed to speak more clearly now. Each note had weight but also softness. It was a combination that made the sound feel alive. The room no longer felt like a gathering of separate people. It felt like one shared silence wrapped around the music. The woman continued without interruption. There was no pause in her focus, no sign of distraction. It was as if she had stepped into a place where time moved differently. Every second felt stretched. Every note felt meaningful. The emotional intensity continued to build, but still in a controlled way. Nothing felt rushed. It was all unfolding naturally, like a story being told with patience and care. Some people in the room felt their thoughts quiet down completely. It was not forced silence. It was internal silence. The kind that happens when attention becomes so deep that everything else fades away. The music now felt like it was approaching a turning point. There was a sense of arrival building in the air, as if the performance was slowly leading everyone toward something they had not yet seen but could already feel. The woman's fingers moved slightly faster for a brief moment, then softened again. This contrast created a wave-like feeling in the sound. It was gentle but powerful, rising and falling like breath. The audience remained completely still. No one wanted to break the moment. Even the smallest sound felt like it would interrupt something important. And yet, even as the emotion deepened and the music grew stronger, there was still a sense that the most powerful moment had not arrived yet. The room waited, quietly and unknowingly, for what was about to come next. The air in the hall felt different now, as if everything inside it had slowed down without anyone asking it to. The music was still flowing from the piano, but the feeling in the room had changed into something deeper, something heavier, something that held everyone in place without force. No one was speaking. No one even felt like speaking. It was as if words had become unnecessary. The woman continued to play, and by now she was no longer just performing a simple tune. The melody had grown into something powerful, something layered with emotion that could not be easily explained. It was still built on the same foundation she had started with, but now it felt like it carried an entire world inside it. Her fingers moved with a quiet intensity. There was no rush, no hesitation, and no effort that could be seen from the outside. Everything looked calm, but the sound told a different story. The piano responded to her touch like it understood her completely. Each note felt placed with care, as if it had a purpose beyond just being heard. The audience was now fully locked into the moment. No one was distracted anymore. Even those who had earlier seemed uninterested were now completely focused. Their attention was not forced. It was taken gently, without them realizing when it happened. Something about the performance had crossed a boundary. It was no longer just a musical display. It felt like a shared experience, something that connected every person in the room without needing explanation. People were not just listening now. They were feeling. The melody began to rise again, but in a controlled way. It did not suddenly become loud or overwhelming. Instead, it slowly gained strength, like a wave building far away before reaching the shore. The emotional weight in the sound became stronger with every passing second. The woman's expression remained calm, but there was something deeper behind her focus. It was as if she had fully entered the music now. Her presence felt steady, but also distant, like she was no longer fully in the room. All of her attention was inside the sound she was creating. The room itself seemed to respond to the music. The silence became more complete, more respectful. Even the smallest movement from anyone felt rare now. Chairs did not shift. Hands did not move. Eyes did not wander. Everything was directed toward the piano. The melody shifted slightly again. A gentle variation appeared, almost unnoticeable at first, but it added a new layer of emotion. It was still simple at its core, but the feeling had changed. It now carried a sense of longing, something quiet but deeply human. Some people in the audience felt a strange pressure in their chest. It was not painful, but it was emotional. It felt like something inside them was being touched gently, something they had not paid attention to for a long time. They did not speak about it. They only felt it. The woman's hands moved smoothly across the keys. There was no visible struggle, no sign of effort. It was as if the music was flowing through her rather than being created by her. The connection between her and the piano felt natural, almost invisible but extremely strong. The melody reached another turning point. This time, the change was more noticeable. The sound grew fuller, richer, and more expressive. It still did not become loud in a harsh way, but it gained a kind of emotional depth that made the entire room feel closer together. The audience seemed to breathe as one. It was not planned. It was not spoken. But there was a shared stillness, a shared attention that had formed naturally. Everyone was experiencing the same moment in their own silent way. The woman continued without looking up. Her focus remained on the piano, but her expression suggested something deeper, as if she was remembering something through the music. The notes she played now felt like pieces of a story that could not be told in words. The melody softened for a brief moment again. This pause felt meaningful. It was not empty silence. Felt like waiting, like the entire room was holding its breath without realizing it. The silence was no longer just silence. It had become part of the performance. Then, the music returned with more strength. The shift was not sudden, but it was clear. The emotional intensity increased, and the sound filled the space in a way that felt almost physical. It was not just heard anymore. It was felt. The audience reacted quietly. Some leaned slightly forward. Others closed their eyes for a moment, as if trying to hold onto the feeling more deeply. No one spoke. No one interrupted. The performance had complete control of the room. The woman's posture remained steady, but her hands now carried a stronger sense of expression. Each movement felt intentional, each note carefully placed. The piano responded like it was part of her thought process, not just an instrument. The melody began to build again, slowly, carefully, like something preparing to reach a peak. There was a sense of anticipation growing in the room. Not nervous anticipation, but emotional anticipation. Something was coming, and everyone could feel it without knowing what it was. The sound became fuller again. It was still controlled, still gentle in structure, but now it carried a deeper emotional force. It felt like layers of feeling were being added one by one, building toward something important. The audience remained completely still. Even breathing felt quieter now. The entire room seemed to exist only for the music. Nothing else mattered in that moment. No outside thoughts, no distractions, only the sound. The woman's fingers moved with slightly more energy now. There was a rhythm forming that felt more powerful but still balanced. It was like the music was climbing a gentle slope, steady and continuous, without breaking its emotional flow. Some people felt their eyes become slightly moist, not from sadness alone, but from the intensity of feeling. The music was not telling a single story. It was telling many feelings at once, layered together in a way that could not be separated. The melody rose higher again, and the room responded with deeper silence. It was not silence of emptiness. It was silence of respect, of attention, of shared experience. No one wanted to break it, not even slightly. The woman continued to play as if time had stopped for her. There was no awareness of anything outside the piano. Every note seemed to carry meaning, and every pause felt intentional. The performance had reached a level where it was no longer just heard. It was lived. The emotional intensity was now at its highest point so far. The music filled the room completely, leaving no space untouched. It felt like everything had been brought together into this single moment, waiting for what would come next. And yet, even at this peak, there was still a sense that something even more powerful was about to happen. The music had not yet revealed its final moment. The room remained still, waiting, completely unaware of how deeply everything was about to change. The room had reached a kind of silence that felt heavier than anything before it. It was no longer just quiet. It was the kind of silence that seemed to hold emotion inside it, as if even the air was waiting for something important to happen. Everyone remained still, fully focused on the woman at the piano, not knowing that they were already standing at the edge of the most powerful moment of the evening. The woman continued to play, but now her presence felt different. The music that had slowly built over time was no longer just growing. It was now fully alive, filling every corner of the hall with a deep emotional force. The simple tune that had started everything was still there, but it had transformed into something far greater than anyone had expected. Her fingers moved with steady control, but there was also a sense of release in her movements. It was as if she was no longer holding anything back. Every note carried meaning, and every pause felt like part of a larger message that could not be spoken aloud. The audience could feel it clearly now. This was no longer just a performance. It felt like a moment that would not come again. People who had entered the evening casually now stood completely absorbed, as if time itself had slowed down just for this. The melody rose gently, not in a sudden burst, but in a smooth and natural wave. It carried emotion that felt deep and real, something that touched every listener differently. Some felt a quiet heaviness in their thoughts, while others simply stood still, unable to move away from the sound. The woman's expression remained calm, but there was something different in her eyes now. It was not visible excitement or pride. It was something quieter, something like understanding, as if she had reached a place inside herself through the music that words could never explain. The piano responded to her touch like it had become part of her breathing. Every note felt connected, every sound flowing into the next without effort. It was no longer about playing correctly or impressively. It was about expressing something deeply human. The room felt smaller now, not physically but emotionally. It was as if all the distance between people had disappeared. Everyone was sharing the same experience, even if they were feeling it in different ways. No one spoke. No one interrupted. No one even thought about leaving. The melody began to slow slightly. This was not an end, but a moment of reflection within the music. The sound softened, and the silence around it became more noticeable. It felt like a pause before something meaningful was about to unfold. Then, gently, the music began to rise again. This time, it carried a deeper emotional weight. It was not louder, but fuller. It felt like memories, feelings, and thoughts were all coming together in one final expression. The audience could sense that something important was approaching. A few people closed their eyes without realizing it. Others pressed their hands together or held their breath. There was no instruction, no direction. It was all happening naturally, guided only by the sound of the piano. The woman continued without breaking focus. Her hands moved with quiet strength, and her posture remained steady. There was no rush in her playing, only flow. It felt as if she understood exactly when to hold a note and when to let it go, creating a balance that made every second meaningful. The melody now reached its highest emotional point. It did not explode or break into chaos. Instead, it expanded gently, filling the room with a feeling that was both powerful and peaceful at the same time. It was the kind of sound that stayed in the heart, even after it faded. The audience remained completely silent, but their silence had changed. It was no longer just attention. It had become emotion. Some people felt a quiet warmth, others felt a deep reflection, and some simply stood still, lost in the moment. The woman's hands slowed slightly as the music began to settle. The final part of the melody was approaching, but it did not feel like an ending in a sudden way. It felt like something naturally coming to rest after a long journey. Each note became softer, more delicate, like drops of sound gently fading into space. The intensity slowly dissolved, leaving behind a feeling that was difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. The room held onto every second. Then, at last, she played the final notes. They were soft, simple, and filled with emotion. They did not demand attention. Instead, they quietly settled into the silence, as if they belonged there all along. The moment she lifted her hands from the keys, the entire hall fell into a deeper silence than ever before. No one reacted immediately. There was no applause, no movement, no sound. Just stillness. A long, heavy stillness that felt full, not empty. It was as if everyone needed a moment to understand what they had just experienced. The woman remained seated for a brief moment, her hands resting gently in her lap. She did not look around. She did not search for approval. She simply sat in the quiet that followed, as if accepting the end of something meaningful. Slowly, someone in the room began to clap. Then another. Then more. The sound spread gently at first, then filled the hall completely. It was not loud or rushed. It was respectful, steady, and full of emotion. Some people were visibly moved. Others kept clapping while looking toward the piano in silence between the sounds. The reaction was not just appreciation. It was recognition. Recognition that they had witnessed something far beyond what they expected. The woman finally stood up from the piano. She gave a small, humble gesture and stepped back from the instrument. There was no attempt to draw attention. No desire to stay in the center. She simply moved away as quietly as she had arrived. As she walked out of the spotlight of the hall, the piano remained at the center, but it no longer felt like just an instrument. It felt like the place where something unforgettable had happened. The applause continued behind her, but it slowly softened into a warm background sound. People were still processing what they had just felt. Some stayed in place, some looked at each other in silence, and others simply remained facing the piano. The evening that had begun like any other gathering had now become something no one there would forget. Not because of volume or spectacle, but because of emotion, silence, and connection. And long after the sound faded completely, the feeling remained with everyone in the room, as if the simple tune they had once dismissed had changed into something that would stay with them for a very long time.